Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We have 43 people in the meeting already, and more are continuing to join. But I think it's important that we kick off because others may have to leave. Welcome to this short training session about the DAC Code of Ethical Business Conduct, which, as you'll see from our first slide, has been developed and approved by 3 leading trade associations in the sector, the BHTA, the UTA, and SIACA. Next slide, please. My name is Chris Whitehouse. I'm chair of the Urology Trades Association and chair and managing director of Whitehouse Communications, which provides the Secretariat and Public Affairs program for that association. I'm also, as it happens, a trustee of the Institute of Medical Ethics, which is why I'm so keen on this particular project. That's me. I'm delighted to welcome Kevin to say a few words about himself.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see a few familiar faces and some new faces there. So Kevin Hodges, Membership Engagement Manager for BHTA, obviously dedicated to supporting the stoma and continence manufacturers section and the DAC section of the BHTA. And for those of you that may not know me that much, been in medical devices for over 20 years, obviously worked in a major company, then ran my own DAC business, and for the last 5 or 6 years been supporting the BHTA and the sections in all activities stoma, continence, DAC related. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. As I say, we're nearly 50 people on this call, so I would ask to exercise a little discipline. If you can keep yourself muted unless invited to unmute yourself and comment. In the first instance, if you could put any questions that arrive in the chat room, by all means, if you think we haven't noticed, raise a hand and we'll try and get to you fairly promptly. We don't intend to make you wait until the end if you've got any questions. We're going to go through the slides, and at the end of each slide, if you've any questions, that's the time to ask them, and we won't mind. Laura, could you put yourself on mute, please? Thank you. So, Kevin, we're going to do this in a fairly informal manner, but tell us, why do you think it's so important to the sector to have a dispensing appliance contract code of ethical business conduct?
Sure, Chris. As you can see from the comments on the slide, there's some very clear headlines there of why. One of the main ones there, I think, is sometimes the ambiguity and misunderstanding that some of our potentially stakeholders have in relation to dispensing appliance contractor. We are a fairly small cohort in the dispensing contractor world versus our pharmacy bricks and mortar colleagues and our distance selling pharmacies, as well as dispensing doctors. And I think there is this sometimes, as I say, they just don't understand potentially what we do. But clearly it is also to demonstrate that we are doing things in a very ethical manner in terms of getting the right product to the patient in their home and following that transparent process whereby the patient may require a more clinically appropriate product to enhance their quality of life. So definitely there. And obviously very topical at the moment is Part 9 in terms of the Part 9 consultation, which will be out very shortly, officially. It's come out, obviously, I won't say unofficially, but officially from ourselves and UCA and SIACA, but not officially released. But it's very pertinent point in time to demonstrate that DACs are operating in a very ethical manner and obviously interacting with the health service and clinicians where appropriate.
I think it's worth, thanks for that, Kevin. I think it's just worth adding that while we stress the ethical behaviour of DACs, there are those who take a different view. And it's important, therefore, that we have a document to which we can point and we can say, if you come across practice that is outside the terms of this document, then let us know, because the reputation of the whole sector depends on compliance with these basic principles. Next slide, please. And I think that is where we come to next. What are the principles? What's this for? Kevin, do you want to talk us through this one?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the principles, it's obviously a consistent level of service. Now, I think I know from first-hand knowledge with a lot of you that we have done a fantastic job over the years, and obviously more recently through the COVID period, when really totally uninterrupted service to the patient, and companies going way beyond what they get paid to do and what's in the regulations. But it is to ensure consistency, and it is focused on patient need. Obviously to build those partnerships and collaboration with the NHS that we all have, but build them in an even stronger way that builds trust. Take away this ambiguity, and sometimes, you know, maybe questions the integrity of what we do to our stakeholders, and show we're compliant as an industry. And I think on the compliance piece, I think clearly what the code tries to do is to pull out some of the activities we do that are not really detailed within the pharmaceutical regulations. So it is taking above and beyond that to take away our own maybe questioning of our activities and make it very clear what should and shouldn't be done. Obviously, we follow the regulations in the letter and the spirit. And obviously just that inherent sometimes conflicts of interest that can again come up from our stakeholders because of the way we are structured in terms of the market of vertical integration, with manufacturers owning the dispensing as well. So we just have to manage that, and clearly to try and build that into the code, and obviously demonstrate clearly what we do over and above the regulations. So those additional services that we give to aid the health service in their care of the patient, but clearly in what we do for the patient over and above what is defined in the regulations.
I think that's important, that the NHS and patients benefit from the work of DACs, and it's not something we should be ashamed of. We should be proud of it. And now that we have a code of practice, we can be much more proactive in promoting that awareness. This next slide, please. The code took a while to develop, and that's because we had to carry the entire sector with us in terms of agreeing what we were trying to achieve, understanding where we are now, and mapping out the route to best practice and identifying that quite clearly. Kevin, if you talk us through the process we went through, that would be helpful, I think, in encouraging people to understand and buy into the code.
Sure. So I would say I think this was an extremely inclusive process. I think, as Chris has alluded to, it did take quite a while. I can't remember the actual version that we ended up on in the end, but I think it nearly got into the 20s. So it was obviously inclusive to get everybody's views. And from those views, we came up with those 4 themes, which were AURs, sampling, product changes, and engaging with patients when developing new products. From the engagement with members, we then went to our other key partners, such as PIPS, which is the Patient Industry and Professionals Forum, clearly the nursing groups in terms of ACA, BOWN and ASCN, and very importantly, the patient associations, and including patients of those patients associations, to get their feedback on the draft we'd created. And you can see some of the headlines there of some of the feedback that ASCN, ACA and PIPS and patient groups gave us around the sampling and around that activity when there is potentially a red flag that's raised that maybe a patient does need some attention in terms of clinical support and the potential of a product change to enhance their quality of life. So in terms of what then happened was to obviously think about how we talk to the NHS about this in terms of what the code aims to address and rebalance. So there's the confidence from the NHS that DACs operate in a patient interest first. DACs are trusted not to exploit the patient because we are in a very privileged position to be able to interact with patients directly, unlike pharmaceuticals can. So we are able to do that. Conflicts of interest, as I mentioned earlier, are effectively managed through that vertical integration structure. And the current market is not radically altered. And I think clearly here, in terms of the code, it's a fairly succinct document in the end, but it can't account maybe for every single circumstance. So I think we need to continue to think about, do things need to be added in as we go through. So it is a framework and a guide to best practice, but it won't cover every single circumstance that may come up. But obviously the trade associations are there to help you where that may come up, to remove any ambiguity you may have. So to ask the question of the trade association, we've come up against this, what do you think?
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think that is important. If nobody is ever found to have breached this code, I would be delighted. But I genuinely expect that people will come forward and say, I'm not quite sure how this applies to my situation or to this particular relationship. And we are perfectly happy to sit down and try and work out the best way forward that protects the interests of all the parties involved. We're going to go in a second into some of the best practice, but before we do that, let me just pause for breath, as I said we would. Does anybody have any questions on why we decided to have a code, the process we went through, and what the code is for? Any questions so far? Don't feel obliged. No, in that case, next slide, please, and we'll have a look in slightly more detail at the 4 areas highlighted by members of our trade associations on behalf of DACs as to where best practice is required and why. What does best practice look like, and why is it so important in each of these 4 stages, Kevin?
Yes, thanks, Chris. So first of all was AURs, and I think, again, sometimes our NHS colleagues use the term AUR, but they use it in the way of an annual review for a patient, not necessarily the AUR process that we follow as a DAC. So we need to ensure that AURs are carried out correctly. So one of the points that's in the intro to the AUR section is about where an AUR should be carried out, and clearly those are either in the premises of the DAC, at the patient's home, virtually, in terms of via remote or video call or by telephone. So it just highlights the very clear regulatory aspects of an AUR, but also that it is not a clinical review. It is the AUR, which is the 4 distinct questions and support that are detailed within the AUR document. It is not a clinical review, but clearly a clinical review can be carried out separately to the AUR, so they shouldn't be mixed. One is an AUR, one is a clinical review. And it is not a sales activity, but a patient benefit activity. So it is, again, all about what the patient requires in terms of enhancing their quality of life with the best, most clinically appropriate product. Again, if there is a requirement for a change, with the interaction of a healthcare professional in any decision on change.
Remind us about sampling as well, Kevin. Why is this so sensitive?
Yeah, I think particularly on the patient group's feedback, there was comments about, excessive sampling, mass mailings of sampling. I do believe that's now clearly doesn't happen. But there was definitely feedback that sampling has a place in terms of ensuring the patient gets the right product for their clinical needs, but it needs to be proportionate. And obviously, again, in terms of the interaction, when a sample is requested by a patient, then it needs to be authorized by a healthcare professional, because we all know with examples like convexity, if an incorrect sample goes out that the patient then uses, then it will cause more clinical problems, etc. So getting the healthcare professional involvement in that process, again, talking about the conflicts of interest in terms of vertical integration, and again, not thinking about the sales aspects. This is about the patient benefits that we're looking at here. And overall, there is a theme here that I think we're all extremely supportive of the drug tariff as a mechanism for reimbursement and remuneration for a DAC. And clearly, we don't want to jeopardize that. And obviously, some of this work was done in the anticipation of a Part 9 review, which is now coming. And I think positively, from all the words in the consultation document, the drug tariff is going to remain, but we need to ensure that we don't jeopardize that with any activities that we may do vis-a-vis sampling or any of the other two that we'll come on to.
Thanks. The other point, of course, that may come as a result of sampling is conversions. Again, Kevin, could you just talk us through this as to why conversions have to be handled sensitively as well?
Sure. I make no excuse for talking a lot about the input of a healthcare professional in terms of a stoma specialist, a urology specialist, a tracheostomy, laryngectomy, speech and language specialist. So any product change must have that healthcare professional input. It should not be, decision should not be made by a customer service person within a DAC or, God forbid, a marketeer within a company. If that patient requires a conversion to another product, it needs clinical input, and we must do that. And I know for sure of examples I've heard that is definitely happening across the board. I would hope, but that's key. And obviously, DACs are NHS contractors. They're not manufacturers distributors. They are a part of a manufacturer's organisation, but they provide NHS services and they are contracted to the NHS to do that. So obviously we've been given some trust in that from all the DACs around the country. So we must, cherish that trust and to look after patient data accordingly. And it should be treated confidentially. And definitely one of the points from NHS England was that last bullet on the conversions point, that patient data is treated confidentially, even with an integrated organisation, and should only be used for the dispensing process. They made that point very clear to us when they reviewed the draft document, which I totally agree with. This is not about a database for marketing. This is a database for dispensing.
Okay, and from time to time, we have new products that come to market. Hopefully that they will, at least in evolutionary terms, improve the patient quality of life and outcomes. But again, just talk us through this fourth point, Ken.
Yeah, and this definitely came up, I think, when we were doing the sort of interaction with members and others about what should and shouldn't be in the code. Initially, this was not in, but I think clearly patients do want to get involved in terms of the product development for companies, in terms of the life cycle of a product and how improvements can be made. So we needed to ensure that could still happen by utilising the database for those patients that do want to be involved in product development. But again, we're saying the MPD process must not be seen as a sales tool. It's about product development, which clearly, again, enhances the patient's quality of life once that product comes to market.
Okay, we've talked about the process we went through to develop the code, why we felt it was important, the main principles that it advances, and let's just have a brief talk next about progress to date and next steps that we've been through. I think it's fair to say that all the BHTA, SIACA and UTA members have adopted the code. And now they've not only adopted it, I think it would be fair to say embraced it, because they see it for what it is, actually an asset to the sector, not just a fig leaf or even a rod to beat them with. It's actually an asset that ensures that we're all clear in our own minds what good practice is. As Kevin has alluded to, NHSE and others made comments which led to some minor updates and clarifications as we went forward. And the document has now been circulated to all members of the 3 trade associations and further discussed with NHSE. Do you want to take us through those next steps, Kevin?
Yeah, and Chris, I guess some of these next steps have actually now happened because we've obviously been, adopted, as you say, and took a little while to get to this point in time. But definitely through our interaction with the Appliance Contractor Review Group team within NHS England, they have communicated it down through their channels to the ICBs. I personally haven't had any exact examples of somebody telling me that, as in from the ICB level, but NHS England have said they have. We've also sent it out to a fairly tight list of stakeholders. We just felt that there was no point going very broad with this, with those stakeholders that may be beyond the normal activities of a DAC, but it is on the next slide in terms of that list of stakeholders. One of the recommendations, and I know I've heard examples of this already happening, is that organisations should, on an annual basis, put some training in place on the code and other regulatory aspects. I'm sure for those of you involved in terms of any support to any healthcare professionals through education or other things, and I'm sure that happens. But we should do it, and as I said, we should continue just to do our checks and balances so that the code is still ready to do what it's got in terms of its content, but also to update where required if new things come up in terms of other questions that we get. One area that BHTA members, support tool the BHTA members have got is a DAC position paper, which also just lays out some of the overall benefits, obviously, that we believe DACs bring to the NHS and to patients. And for those of you with BHTA, I'm sure some of you have been using that. And Chris has mentioned about sort of complaints and ensuring that we love that we don't get any complaints. But if we do, then there is obviously a process in the document which clearly would take us through the complaints process. I think in the past, I personally have had some queries from members to me, and I've hopefully managed most of them directly with then another member. That sometimes is just about understanding and things have been changed, whether that's a website communication or some other activity. But as I say, we've now got an official complaints policy that we will manage. But hopefully we can sort it out before we get into the very serious end of the complaints process, following feedback from yourselves if anything comes up in the marketplace that you think you need to report to us.
Okay, we have just two more very brief slides, if we could have the next one. And I do see some questions arriving in the chat room, so we'll get through these and then we'll move over to the questions. So who did we distribute this to? Well, Kevin's talked about most of these anyway. You can read the list for yourself, but we've circulated it to those who think we needed to know. Here are our contact details for the 3 trade associations, and the DAC Code of Practice is linked to in these slides. After this meeting, we will circulate the slide deck to you all, and we hope that you can use it internally for wider training purposes. Assuming technology permits, we will be embedding the video of this short call into various websites. Again, we will send a link to those to you, but do use it to trickle down to share with colleagues who ought to be aware of this. We want to get it out there. I even put a jacket on for the first time in many months in order that if my mum watches it, she won't send me an email to complain I wasn't smart enough. So here we are. I'm going to take the first question, and Shona MacDonald has raised the question of product development. Does that also, Kevin, do you think, include patient feedback post-launch?
I would say yes. Obviously, if a patient has been in the development of the product, well, obviously yes, because they're already there. But in terms of getting sort of post-market surveillance type of feedback, then I think within obviously the MHRA type of regulatory approach, then you would be doing that. So I would see that for sure as allowable in the scheme of things within the code for sure.
Thank you.
And here is HIM, clinical input. Please can you clarify if this has to be an NHS employed nurse or if a company nurse is acceptable? Kevin.
Yeah, again, we had this question as we were developing the code, and I think, you know, where clearly company nurses are qualified specialist nurses with their RCN PIN, their NMC guidelines, then yes, they would be a point of contact for any potential sample request or product conversion request. So it would be company nurses as well as clearly our NHS colleagues.
I'm not sure in response to the follow-up question that it's possible to audit that directly, and Kevin will disagree with me if he does, but what I would say is that it has been pointed out to us during the process of developing this code that these days there is a very detailed data trail, and that if trends emerge where one supplier's DACs are disproportionately using that supplier's products, that shows in the data. So it is important that people enthusiastically buy into the principles of this, because the granular nature of the data will ultimately reveal trends if practices are not as we would want them to be, which is to say that any healthcare professional, any DACs, should always be putting first the interests of the patient, not the commercial interests of anyone with whom they are involved. Do we have any other questions? In which case, I want to thank Kevin for his input into this short presentation. We've had around 60 people in total on this call. I hope you found it helpful. Please use the material when we circulate the links afterwards. And if you've got any questions, you can always get in touch with your trade body if your internal management can't help. First point of contact, your internal senior management. Second point, come to your trade association. I want to thank you all again and say